Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 172nd episode of Stories of Service. And today is a very special episode because we are going to be talking about the Red Hill drinking water disaster. It's something I've been wanting to talk about for a long time. And today, while I'm here in DC, I'm actually pre-recording this podcast, but I have with me Mandy Feindt. Mandy, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. I'm so happy to be here with you in person.
I know. This is such an honor to be able to talk to you about this issue. I cover so many difficult topics on the Stories of Service podcast. And I think that, as I always say, we learn as a collective and we grow as a community when we have open conversations. And this is an example of that. But before I get started, as I said, this is the Stories of Service podcast, ordinary people who do extraordinary work. And to kick off the show, as I always do, here's my dear old dad, Charlie Pickard.
From the moment we're born and lock eyes with our parents, we are inspiring others. By showing up as a vessel of service, we not only help others, we help ourselves. Welcome to S.O.S, Stories of Service, hosted by Teresa Carpenter. Hear from ordinary people from all walks of life who have transformed their communities by performing extraordinary work.
And as I said, I'm talking today with Mandy Feindt. She is an active duty Major Army officer, proud mother and patriot, and one of the 93,000 people, including her own two children, impacted by the 2021 Red Hill water crisis in Hawaii. She has been a relentless advocate for military and civilian families impacted by the crisis. Serving as both a DoD whistleblower and member of the EPA's Community Representation Initiative, Mandy has demanded military accountability, transparency, safe housing, clean drinking water, and adequate health care for her fellow military families. Over the past 3 years, Mandy has worked extensively with state and federal environmental regulators and members of the health community and senior military and congressional leaders to vocalize the ongoing concern and needs of the Red Hill impacted community. Welcome again, Mandy.
Thank you so much.
So first off, the question I always ask all my guests is, where were you born and raised, and what made you decide to join the United States Army?
Well, I was born in Hampton, Virginia. My granddad retired at Fort Monroe. We're a big Army family, and so that's how we came to be in that area. And so what made me join? I was a senior in high school when 9/11 happened, and I ended up going to school on a track scholarship and ended up picking up ROTC in college just from my athleticism and my desire to be a leader. And, when 9/11 happened, it sort of stuck with me. And I felt like this was my calling to give back to my country and just sort of fall in line with those who had served in my family prior to. And so, yeah, I received my commission through ROTC.
Wow. So did you know what type of job you wanted in the Army when you joined?
When I was in college, I did the Ranger Challenge team, and I was the only female on the team, and so there's a lot of pressure to go into like a combat arms branch, and so there was very, very few of those that were available to females at the time. So I did a combat arms branch, one that was available to me in the beginning, but I soon learned as I was getting my master's in human resources management that was something that I was a little bit more passionate about, to be able to take care of people and prioritize people. It was more in line with what I was studying anyways. And so I moved into a combat support role to be a human resources officer. And I've been doing that ever since.
What's so fascinating about that is that I have a similar story as an aviation electrician's mate. I did feel like I was sort of pushed into a more male-dominated field, but that wasn't really what I wanted to do. I wanted to work with people, and I wanted to have more of a job that aligned with my skill set. And that's just a good example of, maybe well-intentioned initiatives to push women in combat arms positions or in more male-dominated fields. But there are women like myself and you who do gravitate more towards those people-oriented jobs. And when that happens, thankfully, like I say, you ended up in human resources, I ended up in public affairs. But I think it's really important to emphasize that we ought to push people to the jobs that they are most suited to do, and not just to fill a certain need sometimes. I think that's really important because they'll ultimately perform better for the mission that way.
Yeah. And I think going along with that pressure was not necessarily what I wanted to do, and what at my core I was the way I was best serving the military or could serve the military. And so I think for any of your listeners, just go with your gut, especially when you're thinking about what it is that you want to branch, or when you're going into the military, do what your heart tells you, do what you know you're good at, and where you can make your best impact when you're serving our country.
Absolutely. So how long have you been in the Army?
Almost 19 years.
Oh my gosh. So you are like almost at that like point where you could retire, but not just yet. So tell me about some of your early tours in the Army.
Yep. So I did about 3.5 years with Air Defense Artillery, and I sort of stayed in Texas. I did a rotation to Korea with 4 or 5 Air Defense Artillery battalion, and I served with as a launcher platoon leader, and then I moved up to be the battalion S1, which is where I got sort of that on-the-job training to be the senior human resources officer for my unit. Then when I made captain and went to the captain's career course, I was able to do a branch transfer to AG, Army AG, which is the human resources. From there, my career just kind of took off. I ended up going, my first assignment as an AG officer was to the 82nd. I ended up deploying with the 82nd.
Deploying where?
To Afghanistan.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry. And then when I got back from that, I ended up being offered a company command. So I was the headquarters commander for the 82nd Cab, which is, we as AG officers don't get many opportunities to command, especially in a unit as prestigious as the 82nd. And so I felt very honored to do that job. And from there,
how many people did you command?
About 200.
That's a huge staff.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That was awesome.
But it was a phenomenal unit. Being an AG officer, when I was Air Defense, I was kind of stuck in just traditional ADA units. But once I became an AG officer,
AG stands for, say it again.
Adjutant General Corps. I'm
okay.
sorry.
It's okay.
HR.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
But I was able to, serve in so many different types of units. And so to work with, our Army's aviators, it was just an amazing experience. And the mentality of our aviation corps was just wonderful. From there, this was around the time where we were trying to pull more females into being ROTC instructors. When I came through the ranks, and while I sort of felt that pressure of going into a Commodore's branches, because every instructor was a male, I didn't have a female mentor up until this point. And so we had a female commander that was coming on board to be the new cadet commander. And she was looking for females to instruct. And so I went and I interviewed and I got the job. And so I ended up leading command, coming up here to Northern Virginia, back where I'm at now.
Right.
And I was an ROTC instructor at George Mason University for 3 years. And let me tell you, had a lot of really great jobs, but that was one of the best gigs, a hidden gem in the military, just to be able to take that professional need coming out of a deployment. And then after, a command, to come back and to where it all sort of started for me, through the ROTC.
Yeah, it's kind of like a full circle experience.
It was. And just to be with our young, motivated people who were just so excited to serve, it was rejuvenating for me. I'm sure that they all got something out of it, but I took so much from that assignment. And many of those cadets are now, our junior captains and are coming through the ranks. And I still, obviously keep in touch with them. So
I think that's one of the best parts of service. And I think we talk about that a lot of times on the show, or I talk about it on my social media postings, is this idea that you might not always day to day impact every single person or do this like amazing thing, but those individual relationships that you have with your sailors or your soldiers, I think are really what makes service so remarkable and so impactful is to have those relationships. I mean, I just had somebody the other day tell me that something that I did made them proud. And that really like stuck with me because it's like, wow, you're actually setting an example for others to follow, which I think is really remarkable. So tell me a little bit about what happened after you left ROTC. Where did you go next?
So after ROTC, I stuck with pretty traditional Adjutant General Corps jobs. So I went and worked in the space community as a brigade commander. So, brigade commander, a brigade S1, which is the senior human resources officer. Then I went up to work at the G1 level at Space and Missile Defense Command. These assignments were both in Colorado.
Sure.
And from there, I got the unique opportunity to interview and was accepted into a nominative position to be the Deputy J1 at Special Operations Command Pacific in Hawaii, which is what led me to Hawaii and why it is that we're sitting here talking today.
Sure.
But the opportunity to work in the Special Operations community was just one of the best experiences. And I'm so grateful for the time that I had there to work in a joint environment and to work with, some of our nation's best operators was awesome.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Yeah.
All right. So now we're going to address the elephant in the room and the hardest part, I think, of this conversation. But tell me a little bit about what started your journey into becoming an advocate for this incident.
Yeah. So I want to start off by saying that I did not know what Red Hill was before I came to Hawaii. When I went to Korea, I remember getting a country brief and learning about, different assets that we had there, different threats to our troops while we were there. And same as some of the other places I've gone to, I had no idea what Red Hill was. Also, when we first moved to Hawaii, we lived off base. So we lived on the economy until we were offered on base housing. And when we got that call, and for anyone that's moved there on their own, it really stinks to move on your own.
Yeah, sure.
When we got the call that said, hey, we have a home available on historic Ford Island in a home that had survived the attack on Pearl Harbor, where you'll be living, on historic Luke Field, and in the front yard sat the USS Utah, what remains.
Right.
We said, yes. And we moved ourselves, we packed up. And I'd like to say that when we moved to Hawaii, I moved there with a 3-month-old little baby and a 2-year-old, and our family was healthy, and we were loving Hawaii and just immersing ourselves in the culture and everything that, the rainbows and butterflies that you think Hawaii is, all of it and more. We just were so grateful to be there. And so finally we moved into our home in beginning of May of 2021, and almost immediately we started getting sick. But mind you, COVID was still kind of going on around this time. And, we just reasonably thinking people were constantly taking our family to the doctor, constantly taking COVID tests and doing a lot of over counters and really just writing it off as common cold or the CDC crud, the Child Development Center, daycare crud, and didn't think much of it. I will say that a couple things looking back on that I wish I would have paid more attention to is that our son, from the waist down, because at that age, you're not showering your kid, you're submerging him in the bathtub and showering him that way. From the waist down, he was getting these rashes, nothing from the upper body. He also developed this terrible cough that would not go away. And so obviously we were taking him to the pediatrician. He was getting all these topical creams and all these sort of over the counter allergy type things for his cough, and nothing suppressed any of his symptoms. We went through the whole summer sort of dealing with that. And then what we didn't know is that in May of 2021, there was a massive 20,000 gallon fuel leak, and the Navy knew it, and they notified the Department of Health, but they didn't notify any of its residents, knowing that those fuel tanks sat 100 feet above Oahu's sole clean water aquifer, also knowing that they had not accounted for all the fuel that had leaked. And so we fully believe that we were slowly poisoned throughout the summer. And then in November of 2021, a underground train who, did rotations in the underground fuel facilities ended up hitting a pipe.
Okay.
Well, that fuel that was unaccounted for had been stored in a fire suppression line, like a PFAS line. And when that cart hit the pipe, it burst, and that fuel leaked for almost 30 hours before they could contain it. And that was on November 20th of 2021. And for weeks, people just kept drinking it. And for weeks, the Navy knew, the Navy leadership in charge knew. And for weeks, they didn't tell us.
How do you know that? How do you know that they knew about it?
Well, we've gone to court,
right?
There is we are Feindt versus USA. We're the only Feindt in the military. So clearly it's in our name.
Right.
But court documents will reveal that the Navy knew, that they could smell it in their own offices, that they had an indication that fuel had compromised the drinking water. They had an opportunity to warn, and when they failed to warn.
And you've seen this in the discovery documents?
The discovery documents in court, but also, and I hope we link it maybe somewhere once this goes live, is the Department of Defense IG reports that were released 3 years after.
Right, just recently, actually.
November, yeah, they were released. And so we've got two sort of, ways of obtaining that information. But also, when I finally found out when my kids ended up in the hospital, I took a huge stand, regardless of my affiliation with the military. I had many behind closed doors, but recorded conversations, because Hawaii is a one-party consent state. And I have thousands of hours of recordings of private conversations that I had with very senior military leadership who divulged a lot of this information to me.
What?
Mm-hmm.
You didn't tell me that part.
Yeah.
So you
It's
were
all really, it all came out in court.
in
and
court.
I had to turn over all
You had to
of
turn
that.
it over all your one party
Recordings.
consent legal recordings
Oh, yeah.
that you were doing, where senior leaders told you that they knew and that they did not put it out publicly.
For example, one thing was,
Yeah, be specific.
I'll be specific on one incident that really impacted my family, is that we were told in early December that Ford Island, Manana, Camp Smith, a couple of these different neighborhoods had been verified to be safe. So we kept drinking our water. And when we finally, a week later, they walked that back and said, hey, we made a mistake here. When I was behind closed doors with the director of the MWR and the deputy base commander saying, hey, we need to get clean water to the Ford Island Child Development Center, which was the largest child development center on the Navy's drinking water system, 250 children plus under the age of 5, and all the staff were still not getting clean water. And I said, why is it that our CDC, this CDC, which is where happens to be where my kids were going to school, why aren't they getting clean water? And why didn't they in the beginning? And the deputy base commander basically told me that I said, where are the test results? And he said, it wasn't based off of testing, it was based off of call-ins. So they weren't actually, even though they were telling people that it was verified to be safe, it wasn't verified by testing. They weren't actually testing. Instead, they were flushing the system for hours. I'll never forget, I used to go paddleboarding like every Saturday. They flush. So we didn't have access to our sprinkler systems. They would be turned on by, whoever managed the water systems on the base. Our sprinkler systems ran over the entire weekend, just flushing out all this contaminated water. Our fire hydrants were just gushing water, flooding the streets.
Right.
And what they were doing is they were trying to get rid of as much evidence as possible before they actually started testing. And so what I have in court documents will show that even some of the testing that they did, they discarded it, or they knew potentially what the contaminant was, and they tested for things other than what the actual contaminant was. They knew the spill had happened. And what bothers me about, it's horrendous. And what bothers me about that is that we say that, to my core, this is what bothers me the most, is that we say people are our greatest asset. We throw that slogan around everywhere, all across our military.
Sure. It's all on our messaging.
This was a case where we didn't put our money where our mouth is. We allowed a military asset to poison our people. We, on American soil, right?
Yeah.
Our American military families and American civilians on American soil were poisoned by military asset. And we didn't put our people, we didn't make our people our greatest asset. Like, literally.
Oh man.
And so my biggest thing is when they failed to warn, Teresa.
Because if they had warned, let's just walk this back.
Yeah.
What would the outcome have played out if, as soon as they knew, they had let people know?
People wouldn't have cooked their Thanksgiving meal with contaminated water. Thousands of people would not have ended up in the hospital. Thousands more, like my family, would not have been evacuated from their home for 3 to 4 months. Thousands of people would probably be healthy or healthier than they are today.
I'm sure you've seen like what the Navy side is of this. Like, what is their side when asked, like at town halls and things like that? What do they say?
They lied. I mean, I hate to use that word. It's a very hard word. They lied to families. They lied to children at town halls when they asked questions. They lied to people. And you have the recordings of the town halls where they. Oh yeah, this is the biggest cover up I think we've seen in American military history since Camp Lejeune, as far as things like this. This is a mirror image of what happened at Camp Lejeune, as far as the cover up, the denial. What I've learned through all this is that no evidence, meaning no testing in the beginning, equals no testing equals no evidence, which equals no indication of long-term harm. And that's been the biggest thing that we've had to fight. Yeah, it is. So what happens at the town halls? Do they just stand by because you've had now the IG report that shows that does the IG report say, and I do apologize, I didn't have a chance to take a look at it. Does the IG report say that they knew? It does say that. Knew, failed to warn, and when they failed to warn, they prevented people from taking care of their families, and they did not prioritize the health and safety of their force. And the IG report says that. It says that. And now that there is this IG report, what's been the result of the IG report?
Absolutely nothing.
there's not been a single ounce of accountability. And I hate to be Stu Scheller, and hopefully he'll watch this, but when Stu Scheller says that he's the only officer that's been held accountable for the shoddy withdrawal in Afghanistan, you've got two main military whistleblowers, me and Shannon Bunce. We have been the only ones whose careers have suffered. And that is because we took a stand, and because we became DoD whistleblowers, and because we stood up for what we believed was right, which was to prioritize the health and safety of our people. And we both, and I'll speak for myself, have had a target placed on my back. My career, overnight went.
Tell me what you mean.
I mean, I had to ask for an expedited transfer. I had to ask for compassionate reassignment.
And that was for medical reasons, right?
Well, the compassionate reassignment, yes, for medical reason. The expedited transfer is because I made a DoD IG complaint saying that I was, being grossly retaliated against once I started going to Congress and the news and reporting.
What were they doing? Can you give me some examples of the retaliation?
Oh God, behind closed doors, just berating me, treating me differently. I left the unit for, these are just a couple of administrative things that are covered under DoD whistleblower. I left the unit for the first time in my career on a compassionate reassignment, no fault of my own, without a PCS award. I was in the zone for promotion to lieutenant colonel, and I was promised a certain, evaluation to help me get through those boards. And in the same way that we take care of any soldier, any senior leader. That's
right. When they know you're up for a promotion,
they take care of you.
Yeah. So for people that don't know how that works, is that when you're in the promotion zone, what they'll do is the people that are and this is careerism at its finest, to be honest. I mean, I don't necessarily agree with how we do this, but that's a whole nother story.
Yeah.
They'll put the people that are like brand new into the ranking at the lower end. And then the people that are up for promotion that are close to getting it, who have done all the right things and made all the right people happy, they'll push them forward. And so what you're telling me is that you were a major at that point where you needed really, really strong paper to make lieutenant colonel, and you had every indication that you would.
Well, the interesting part is I was, one of the senior human resources officers for the unit. I managed senior rater profiles, meaning I helped do the exact process that you just explained. Here are new folks,
right.
Sir, gentlemen. Here's who is in the zone for promotion.
Yeah, here's who needs to break out. Here's who.
Correct.
Here's who can afford to stay at the average. Here's who.
So I was projected to get a top block OER, which would have set me up for success to be promoted. And my evaluation was due on 1 December 2021. So just at the time that my family had been impacted by the crisis. I did not receive that evaluation until the first day that I took leave to go my very first, like when I loaded the plane to go my very first congressional trip about Red Hill in February of 2022 is when they sent me my evaluation, which was subpar at best, mediocre at best officer. And I ended up not. And as much as I tried to, none of the quantitative and qualitative data that I actually or activities I actually did while I was in that seat for the past year were included. It was written in a way that said, signaled to the board that something has happened, but we were not going to say. And that's what we do. That's called administrative retaliation. I see it all the time being in my field.
It's kind of like an example that I'll bring up that I understand from personal experience is when a senior rater will put you at their average two cycles in a row. Like, in other words, your write-up doesn't say anything that could indicate there's a disciplinary issue, because there is no disciplinary issue and you're doing everything right and you're trying to make an impact. But what they'll do is they'll put you at their average 2 cycles in a row. And that sends the message to the board that you are not the right officer to be promoted to the next pay grade. So that's an example.
And that's exactly what happened to me. 2 in a row. So what ended up happening is I ended up leaving.
And tell me a little bit about your human resources job during this time, even with all this stress. Were you performing? Were you continuing to do the job? Were you taking care of your people? Tell me a little bit about that.
So that's a very great question. So, obviously prior to December, I'd actually been in the unit for over a year, but I got an extended evaluation because I went to this joint operations course. So we ended up working out that I would do like an extended evaluation to set me up for success, get a great evaluation before I went into the board. Up until December. So, all of that, none of that stuff was captured. Then in December, my next evaluation period started. Well, when my family was evacuated from our home for 4 months, I was families were being told that they could, work from home, or that the priority was to take care of their family. I mean, we didn't have childcare, nothing. And getting childcare in Hawaii is just an absolute nightmare, as it is on most military bases. But it's particularly tough. And in time of COVID as well, getting slots available, it was just a difficult time. And so I was given the latitude because we had another O4 officer in my office who covered down on my duties. I was told that my duties were being taken care of, that my priority was my family. I mean, we were in and out of doctor's appointments at that point. By the way, I've been to like 650 medical appointments. But that was my priority. My place of duty was in the hotel while we were evacuated from our home. And the priority was, taking care of my family, and that my duties were being covered down on. That's important to note, because in the military, when something when there's an extenuating circumstance, someone gets medically sick, you have to take some sort of leave, you're out for an extended period of time, you can do sort of this exception to policy where you have this unrated time. That is an option.
Yes.
I should have left the unit with unrated time. That would have been a way to take care of me.
Unrated time. I've heard of things like that. Like when I've had colleagues who've had to take care of like a sick spouse, and one in particular stands out. I think this person took care of their spouse for a year, and I don't think they were still getting a paycheck, but they weren't. So that's what it would be, is unrated time. So it just doesn't count.
It doesn't count.
I didn't realize that the fit rep system, or maybe in the Army at least, I'm sure it's that way in the Navy too, that there is actually
there's a special code
or a special way to capture that
extenuating circumstances. And certainly a water contamination crisis that has put you out of your home.
I see. So you were on that. You were on that time.
Well,
or told that.
Yeah, I was told that my place of duty was the hotel, and that my priority was to take care of my family. And again, in and out of. I mean, we were so sick, Teresa. I mean, we've lived at the Children's Hospital. We, it's been horrendous, and where I'm stationed now. So, I should have left with unrated time. Instead, exactly what you said. Not only did I get a subpar evaluation in December, several months later, I got another evaluation with like nothing, essentially, except I, did an inventory on some of our equipment in the very beginning before my family was impacted by the water crisis. That's like literally the only data point that it had. And again, it marked me as a subpar officer. Nothing about my advocacy and how I had advocated and helped thousands of military families through a humanitarian water, crisis. Nothing about that at all was mentioned, because that's what I was doing.
Right.
I was taking care of my family, and I was taking care of people, whether they were assigned to my unit or just, in the joint environment, because this didn't just impact Army families. It impacted service members across the board, and it impacted civilians as well.
Sure.
But so they made a deliberate choice to screw me, meaning they gave me 2 back-to-back subpar evaluations. I left the unit without a PCS award to capture any of my time that I was there, prior to the water crisis.
So tell me about what would happen when you would talk to your boss about some of these things.
Oh, it became so in the special operations community, it's a very small, close-knit community where I was Mandy, and, very well respected, and went on hikes with the commander's wife, and, folks played golf with my husband, and it was just very close knit. I immediately went from Mandy to Major Feindt, and everything was on counseling statements. Whenever I would go in and talk to my boss, there'd be a lawyer in the room. Like, it became very, this is like tons of red tape, tons of restriction.
Was it like overnight?
I was being searched before I walked into the building to make sure I didn't have recording devices on me. I was
really?
I was being read like all sort. I mean, I was being treated differently than anyone else. So not only was it like a DODIG retaliation, it was also like an,
isolation,
an EO thing.
EO thing.
Not doing
culturally.
This for anyone else. Yeah.
Yeah, like culturally.
The environment was completely hostile.
Did it happen overnight that way, or was it as soon as you started doing advocacy?
It was as soon as I started doing advocacy.
So as long as you were sick and just taking care of your family, that was fine. It was the fact that you went public with your advocacy. And then once you did that, it was like everybody just started being careful around you.
Yeah, 0 to 0 overnight.
How did the rest of the team respond to you?
As far as so not only I'd like to also say that it wasn't just my own chain of command at Special Operations Command Pacific. It extended far and beyond. And the way that I know that is I knew it personally, but to actually go to court and have the Navy and all these agencies submit their text messages and their emails because they're required to, mandatory by court. I was able to see most people who file retaliation complaints. It's kind of like his word against hers or whatever, but to actually like see it in black and white, to see the text messages, to see the things that they were saying to me in email. It was sick, but it was also pretty vindicating.
Like, what do you mean?
Because most folks don't get that opportunity. Names I was being called, the threat that I was, the intention that I was bringing to this, how enough restriction was not being placed on me, how, folks needed to reel me in, and nothing about like, this woman is literally putting her neck out there to help families who aren't receiving information from their own command. This woman is trying to actually help. Like, she cares enough to want to see you guys get this right, and you're royally screwing it up. And like, maybe we should listen to her. No, I was treated like the enemy.
So Special Operations Pacific, that's located, I think it's co-located within Indo-PACOM, right? It's in the same building. So you can't bring a recording device into those skiffs. I mean, it's not a skiff rather, but into past the security area in the front anyway. So they just thought that maybe you would just violate that rule and you would still just come in with a recording device. I mean, and you were searched.
Yeah. And I was read, like, my husband and I went in, we asked for an open door policy with the commander. We asked for our lawyer to be dialed in during this meeting, because our lawyer was, at a different location. So when my husband and I walked into the unit commander office, he's a 2-star general and he's got his command attorney there. And I said, our attorney is waiting and we'd like to dial our attorney in too. That we're clearly represented. And I was a DOD whistleblower at this point, and he wouldn't allow me to call my attorney, but he had his attorney in the room.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
I was, a lot of my rights were taken away from me, and I was given unlawful orders. I was given orders in counselings to destroy evidence. If you have recordings of me, I didn't authorize for you, you need to destroy this. I was also told at one point that I needed, even though I was told like your place of duty is here, you now need to get a family care plan, which I wasn't authorized or required to have because I'm not a dual family and I wasn't a single parent. But again, we had other people who were out of the office for this same thing, and they weren't being told what I was being told. It was because I was an outspoken advocate.
That's right.
And I wasn't, burying my head in the sand. I wasn't doing the whole shut up and color thing. I wasn't going along with it. I was saying, this is a matter of public health and safety, and we have an obligation to prioritize the health and safety for people, and we're not doing that. And they didn't like that.
That's just crazy. I'm sorry you went through that.
And still going through it. I mean, I had, like I said, I filed for Department of Defense whistleblower protection and launched several complaints starting in February of 2022. And to this day, as I sit on the couch with you, that my own personal investigation has not been adjudicated, still almost 3 years later.
And the way this stands now, just for the viewers out there, so that they can kind of understand the situation in this case a little bit better, is the fact that you, by law, are not able to sue the DOD, but your husband, as a civilian, can. So the lawsuit is actually in your husband's name, and then the other people who are on the lawsuit, they also are family members, because active duty cannot sue due to the Ferris Doctrine, which I have covered in a previous podcast, which is the fact that military members cannot sue anybody who has performed something within the line of duty. And that includes suspected medical malpractice. I think it has even applied sometimes to sexual assault. I've heard about and seen in some other cases. So there is a court system that's playing out. I had Staff Sergeant Carter on my show in regards to that issue. So there were ways with your families to try to get that justice, but then you, as active duty, you bared an additional brunt because you were doing something that nobody else was doing on and you weren't the only active duty, right? You said there was one other.
Yeah. So Shannon Benz, we actually just did a joint for the first time now that the IG report from the incident is out.
And I'll
And we
link
can
to
actually,
that
yeah, we can actually
to that
talk and we can actually
podcast
be friends in
and the IG
public.
report.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We actually did a joint podcast with Walk the Talk Foundation.
Yes.
And so she is the other whistleblower. The interesting thing about her is, so I offer perspective from, an impacted family, what happened to us, the messaging that was given to us, the lack of communication, lack of transparency. Shannon Bentz was actually the former fuels director at Red Hill. And when she started raising the red flag, they fired her.
Yeah.
She tried to prevent this whole crisis from happening.
Yep. And Walk the Talk Foundation, I believe, is putting out a 3-part series.
Part 1 dropped last week.
Part 1 dropped last week. We're pre-recording this podcast, and I'm not sure when we're going to go public with it. So it could be that all 3 episodes are out by the time this one gets out, or we might do this one in conjunction with one of those to try to spread that awareness and keep this message alive. But wow. So 2 of you decided to go on active duty. You decided to speak up. What happened to her? Did she have a similar trajectory with her career?
Oh yeah, she's been 2-time non-select. We're both 04s, by the way. Ironically enough, 2 females, both 04s, both
have families that are impacted,
who have been impacted, and our careers have just plummeted.
What was the reaction from military leadership to the IG report? Was there anything public that was put out?
They have still not publicly addressed it.
Okay, so the IG report was just published.
It was published, and the Red Hill Task Force, who was responsible for transparency and communicating information about the Red Hill water crisis to families, has not released it publicly to its family members. Now, of course, all of us who are, part of the advocacy community, and I sit on a board that represents the community, at large that have been impacted. And so certainly we've raised it and it's been raised in the press, but the folks responsible or the IG has not ensured that every person that was impacted by the crisis has actually received it, whether that be email form or door-to-door delivery of, notification, their Facebook account, none of that. Yeah, so it's just been from grassroots advocacy who has been able to communicate some of this stuff to the impacted families.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That's just really unfortunate. And I can only hope that come this Wednesday with the new administration taking over, that there's going to be some forward momentum on this. And I would like to think that they'll take a hard look at what happened and really provide you and your family with the care and the compensation that you need and the transparency that you need to know that you guys can move on.
True, sir. There's one thing that I wanted to correct. So you are right that there is a federal lawsuit in my family's name. And so, all the folks who file suit are part of this Mass Tort Claims Act, and it will fall under the Feindt versus U.S. case. But in November of last year, so actually Veterans Day last year, 5 service members filed a lawsuit. It's called Whaley versus the U.S. Whaley is a full bird colonel in the Army. So she's the lead on this case. And 5 active duty service members, and I'm one of them, did file a federal lawsuit against the government. It has not been responded to. And all cases that have come up from the Red Hill water crisis are being put on hold until there is an adjudication from our federal lawsuit, the Feindt case. But, we thought right away they'd come back with theirs, and that hasn't happened. And our argument is that you're right while you're in the line of duty, but our argument from our attorneys is that when Major Feindt, for example, was at home cooking spaghetti dinner for her kids and breathing in those toxic fumes, and when she was showering and when she was, bathing her children,
right,
washing her clothes, sleeping in sheets that had been, she was not in the line of duty then. She was at her safe haven, her home, whether that be on base or not. She was off duty and therefore not in the line of duty when I was poisoned.
So what would happen when you would go to these town halls? I'm just so curious. Like, what would the dialogue be like with you and the military leadership?
Sure. I'll give you one example. One of the first town halls that I had spoke at, I went there. My advocacy really began to get clean water to the Ford Island CDC, Ford Island On-Base Child Development Center that I talked about earlier. I was concerned because not only one, that we had not received clean water. I mean, weeks after the crisis had happened, these kids were still not getting clean water. I was also concerned because when my family ended up in the ER, I had a doctor first of all, they refused every amount of testing. So I was like, I'm their parent. Take their hair, skin, nails, like take a body part,
Right,
like I was just like, I want
Yeah.
to know as a parent, I reserve the right to know like how much of this toxic stuff is in their body. And also like, I want their doctors to be able to know
Sure,
that so they can
sure.
properly care for them.
Mhm.
They being Tripler would not, it wasn't just my family, thousands of families, I think 7,000 families over the first week ended up in the hospital. And no testing was done, which bothers me because again, I think I stated it before, no testing equals no evidence, which equals no indication of long-term harm. And that's been the Navy's narrative, that there's no indication of long-term harm. Well, why is that? You didn't test anybody, just like you didn't test anyone at Camp Lejeune. So anyways,
Okay.
sorry, I got off track.
No, I was talking about, because I'm really interested in the transparency piece. I mean, I think as a person who's been a professional communicator my whole life, it's astounding to hear about this from your perspective. And granted,
the town hall.
Yeah, and granted, and I will be the first to admit, I haven't had a person from the Navy contact me to talk about this case. I have not talked to somebody in the Navy. Mandy, this is your story, off duty, out of uniform, and this is your perspective. But I think that it's important to have these conversations on the sides of the people who are impacted, and then give the other side an opportunity to respond. So tell me a little bit about how they would respond when they were facing you.
Yeah. So the town hall, I like advocate. I mean, here I am like taking my uniform off, and now I'm just like, that's why my handle is like Major Mom. Cause then I just became like a mother at this point, mama bear who's advocating for her kids. When I went to the hospital, I told the ER doctor when it is that we stopped drinking the water, went through all of that. They refused testing. I was very upset about that. But you know what? They did have the audacity to tell me, hey, Mom, that sippy cup, was that previously washed, in your home? Well, yes, Captain Obvious. I didn't buy it on my way over here, Well, you might, Mom, still be poisoning your own child. That is because, this plastic thing, it's a porous material and it holds on to contamination. The fuel leaches on it in the same way that if you, put a spaghetti dinner in a plastic Tupperware and you wash it and sometimes that red residue doesn't come out. It's the same thing. It still stays in, that contamination still stays in these personal use plastics. And so that was my advocacy. I would go to town halls and say, you're telling us to, put our Keurigs to the side and all these personal use plastics that are in our kitchens to decide and make a claim through the Army legal process, but you have not replaced the personal use plastics in our child development centers, things from sippy cups to teething toys, everything. I mean, my kid was 1, right? So everything is ending up in his mouth and he's chewing on it. To the utensils that they were using to cook their meals, none of that stuff had been replaced, but we were being told to replace it in our own home, right? And to file a claim. And I said, how is it that we're not prioritizing our military children? So that was my fight. And the DHA commander at the time, Major General Place, he's since been replaced, but the DHA commander was on this panel that I was at, and I raised this question. He said, Major Feindt, it's too easy. We can just wash the stuff with clean water, clean soapy water, and then give it the old smell test. And then if it still smells or still tastes, maybe wash it with soap and water one more time. And then, maybe then we can toss it or whatever. And I'm like, is this man serious? Like, we're talking about our kids. We're talking about innocent children. And I said, I thought to myself, like, my child is 1 year old. Do you think he has the vocabulary to say, hey, Miss Sam, who was his teacher at the time, who was responsible for 20 plus kids in her classroom? Do you think he has the vocabulary to say, hey, I know you washed this, Miss Sam, but it still tastes like jet fuel as if he knows?
Yeah, like he wouldn't know that.
He doesn't have the vocabulary to advocate for himself.
Right.
And that was the response. Not only that, but we also wrote Dial, like dish soap company, right? And we said, hey, have you tested your products on jet fuel? Like, can you make a statement about that? And they wrote back and said, no, we've not tested her, and we don't stand by this guidance that was given out by the DHA commander. So they were just putting out like just bullshit, just BS information and telling us, and there was no like science backed by this. The bottom line is they were not prioritizing our children. And when I started calling these things out and reading things like about toxic exposure and jet fuel exposure and what the CDC and the ATSDR were saying about how we should make our kids, who are the most vulnerable population besides our immunocompromised, the priority, they were our last priority. And I, as a mom and an advocate for military families, was not going to allow that to be okay, especially because, again, my two littles were impacted by this.
Right.
And I also just felt this conviction that as a mom, I knew how it personally impacted my family, but also as a senior leader, because I'm an old mom, as you know. So when I'm dropping my 1 and 3 year off, most parents of 1 and 3 year olds at our CDCs are our most junior, officers, enlisted families. And I have once been a junior, service member. And I, at that point, didn't have my voice. I didn't know my resources. I didn't have the fortitude then. And so I felt this obligation to speak up for those families too. Because there were tons of families that reached out to me that said, my spouse doesn't work. We are one income family and we just can't afford the retaliation that comes with this. Like, we need this job. But it was sad to me that families did not feel like they could advocate for their own children because of fear of retaliation.
It is
about sad. A matter of public health and safety, Teresa.
I mean, have you received any kind of threats, any kind of thing? I mean, what you're talking about is so big in my mind. And I'm just curious, like, do you ever worry about, like, if somebody could come, like literally, like, is your safety at risk over this?
Shannon, Vince, and I both have feared for our safety. I mean, when all this stuff is going on, look at what happened to, like, those two, like, Boeing whistleblowers, right?
Right.
They're not here anymore.
That's my point.
Security cameras have been installed constantly. I love it when you, like, go to these, like, mental health appointments and they're like, do you ever feel like someone's watching you? And I'm like, are you still, like, in the crazy state, or do I actually think someone's watching you? Because the answer is yes.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's a valid feeling.
It
mean,
is.
Like, Target has truly been placed on my back. I am constantly feeling like I'm being watched, or that someone's listening.
Oh, I know.
To
like,
my
I told you, like,
phone,
I just, like, heard something on my phone right here, and I'm like, oh my gosh, or we heard somebody upstairs, and I'm like, wait a minute, there wasn't supposed to be anybody at this Airbnb, or maybe there was somebody, but why did somebody come upstairs and then leave? I mean, that's like where my brain is going right now with the stuff that we're talking about, because this is such a huge issue that impacts so many people and doesn't have an easy answer. And I don't know how any group of people is going to solve this problem and really give everyone the compensation that they deserve. But I mean, all I can say is hopefully we can follow an example that's been done in the past with the Camp Lejeune case. Hopefully that did get resolved in a way that was fair and compensated the families adequately for what they've suffered. But these are huge issues with no easy answers.
Yeah, on Camp Lejeune, really quick. So what separates us from Camp Lejeune, I just want to put a plug out for the Camp Lejeune community and families. When this happened, I'll be honest, my own ignorance, Camp Lejeune happened when I was a small child. I didn't know a lot about Camp Lejeune, but they knew a lot about us as soon as Red Hill happened, and they welcomed us with open arms.
That's
like,
wonderful.
I have flown out to Camp Lejeune. I have, two of my greatest mentors are part of the Camp Lejeune community.
Mm-hmm.
What separates us is, one, the power of social media, which they didn't have back then. And we found out about this in real time, where Camp Lejeune families, it was covered up for so long that they didn't have an opportunity to take it to the courts or to be more proactive with their help, like we're being. Camp Lejeune there was a special stipulation or special part of the PACT Act that was included for Camp Lejeune, but that doesn't mean they've been compensated. In fact, I'm not aware that anyone has been compensated for Camp Lejeune. All that portion of the PACT Act did for Camp Lejeune is give them a day in court. They still have to go through the same process that we are right now.
I mean, it makes you
30
wonder,
plus years later.
It also makes you wonder too, like, I mean, maybe there isn't the money to do this. I mean, I don't have easy answers on any of this. And I'm not an expert on government, but I mean, what you're talking about is so massive that's probably why a parent, we don't know, I don't know for sure, but that's why, a suspected cover-up might have occurred, because it's very hard to figure out what you're going to do in a case like this. I mean, everybody from the PACT Act, have they been compensated? I would imagine not.
Oh, but that's been a nightmare.
Right.
And I think that if you would speak to any outspoken advocate, whether it be me or members of the Burn Pits community or Camp Lejeune, it's never about the money. No amount of money will give me my kids' health back.
Right.
No amount of money will take away the trauma that our family has experienced. No amount of money will bring Janie Ensminger back, who was Jerry Ensminger's daughter, who died of leukemia. No amount. It's not about the money. It is about having your day in court. It is about accountability, and not an ounce of accountability has been taken or given. For anyone that was in charge.
Let me ask you a question. Okay. Now I'm just going to go play a role here, because I'm really fascinated by this. because you're right, it's not about the money, but there's got to be something to help compensate the families. But what if people just owned it, just said they were sorry? The people who needed to be fired, who they know lied, were disciplined in some sort of way. But you didn't get all the money that you needed. You didn't get the full compensation that you felt you deserved. Would that be enough?
The most disheartening part of all of this is that not a single person has been held accountable. A couple of examples. Or before we get to that, the other disheartening part about this is that even when some of us stuck our neck out and I contacted, for example, the Secretary of Defense, wrote him, he's the first person I wrote, or when I contacted the Secretary of the Army's office, or when I went and spoke to the Secretary of the Navy, not a single dignitary that came to our island that was put in a position of authority or power by this administration, when they came to Hawaii, not a single one stepped foot in a home of an impacted family to see that they were camping out in their homes, to see the towers of water bottles that were built up. Some of them are still showering with water bottles today in January of 2025, because the water is still not safe. That part is super disappointing. The other thing is the commander of Pacific Fleet at the time was Admiral Sam Paparo. He was barred from testifying in our court case. He was, protected completely by the military. Now, in the beginning, I just couldn't understand why. Well, then a couple months later, it turns out that he was, Secretary Austin's top pick for CNO, Chief of Naval Operations, the most, senior.
Did they tell you why he wasn't able to speak at the
No, not at the time.
What did they you just were told that he wasn't going to speak?
A court thing. The Navy somehow was able to protect Paparo from testifying in our court case, but you could read the legalities on that. They said he was too senior and there were some other things, but that's all in the court case. But the real reason is because he was being picked for CNO. Well, in a crazy turn of events, President Biden did not select him. We know who the new CNO is. That's a topic for a different day. But instead, when he didn't get picked for that position, he was then nominated for the Indo-Pacific commander, the largest combatant command, which still resides in Hawaii. So you can only imagine what the people of Hawaii feel about this guy being in charge there. He was nominated and then confirmed. I went to a Senate confirmation hearing with a sign in the background that said, "Poisoned on Paparo's watch," with a picture of my two kids. And he was confirmed.
Was he asked hard questions by the senators for theater?
I had
for show.
You mean like Pete Hegseth's
right.
hearing? It was a little different. I had met with many members of the Senate Armed Services Committee the day prior to his confirmation hearing with a couple of other family advocates. And we explained that this was such a slap in the face to impacted families and to the people of Hawaii, and that, culturally, and just like this would just be outrage. And how disheartening it was that not only had he not been held accountable, because this was the senior Navy guy in charge. He was in charge of the messaging. He was in charge of, he was part of withholding that information. Like, he knew and he smelt and all these things, the fuel, and was part of not being transparent with our community. He's one of those people that I solely blame for my kids being poisoned. Had he and other commanders in charge of this crisis said anything, I would have been able to protect my children. He took that right away from me. My greatest privilege and my biggest right as a parent was taken from me because of leaders like Admiral Sam Paparo. But for some reason, the Secretary of Defense, the Senate Armed Services Committee, the President of the United States thought that he was the best fit for the job, even though he was not able to take care of 93,000 people under his watch when he was the Pacific Fleet commander. So he was confirmed, and that's where he still sits today. Yeah. And guess what else? I'll give you another one. I'll double down on that. My commander, remember I told you about that 2-star general who allowed me to be retaliated against in his command, Major General Rudd. Guess where he is now?
Where?
He's Admiral Paparo's deputy. He's the deputy commander of Indo-Pacific Command. The guy who wouldn't let me call my lawyer.
Right.
Who took away my rights from me. That guy.
Wow.
That is the definition of accountability as it currently stands in the military today.
And that's a huge problem. I mean, I don't even know, as a very small podcaster, as I always like to say, I don't even know where you begin to heal the lack of transparency, the moral injury, the inability to, it pisses me off. It makes me very emotional because this is an organization that I love.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to hear stories like what you, I'm sorry, I didn't expect to get emotional.
No, it's fine. I got
But-
emotional on the Freedom
But
That's for Freedom podcast. I was just boohooing.
I mean, I'm
Stephanie was
just,
like, oh,
I
gosh.
can't believe I'm getting emotional
Yeah.
listening to this, but it's just, I knew this podcast was going to be a really hard one. And I knew that I wasn't going to be able to keep it together. And that's why I pre-recorded it also, was because I just knew like, this is probably one of the hardest topics I've taken on. The COVID vax was hard too. If I had interviewed somebody that had been vaccine injured, I think I would probably be in the same place that I'm here right now, listening to what you're saying. But I think it's because we all have so much invested in this organization, and we want this organization to be better, and we love serving. Like, we love service. This is about our love for service. This is why we speak up. And what happened to you is just and your family is such a tragedy, and it must be corrected.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what that looks like for you. And this is not something that one party can fix. I mean, that's kind of where I stand on this. Like, some of these things, like the COVID one, you can walk that back a little bit, but even Brad was saying, it's still going to be tough, but there'll be some things that you can do. So I just hope that you can work with the administration to get some sort of a compromise in place to where the families feel like they got some things that they needed to feel as though they can move forward. Are you optimistic that that can happen?
This is where I'll get emotional, is that I talked about some of my jobs that I had, when I was an ROTC instructor. I've got cadets who have come through the ranks, and I feel a lot of moral injury. I feel like I didn't necessarily prepare them for something like this, and I feel guilty about that. I have a lot of mom guilt, obviously, for what the signs that I missed, and not only that, but that my own institution that I've risked my life for has done this to my kids. There is more than anything, there's this great sense of institutional betrayal. The fact that no one has been held accountable. Like, how can people, first of all, live with themselves? But how can they get away with it? Every single leader who's been in charge of this crisis has either retired with their career intact, pinned another star, moved on with their life, and has received increased responsibility. I don't understand, but the answer is yes, I absolutely do. I am so hopeful for this next administration. I mean, that's all it can be. This issue, I want to be clear, this issue is an apolitical issue.
It is.
It has impacted every gender, race, religion, political affiliation, like every branch of service. It has civilians, military families alike. It has impacted thousands, upon almost 100,000 people. And I'll say this too, we use this number, 93,000 people. It doesn't account for people like, this happened over the holidays, over Thanksgiving. It doesn't account for people like my parents who were in Hawaii celebrating with us.
Like people that came in and visited and then went in and out. And
Pearl Harbor,
and who were impacted.
Like one of the top 3.
Oh, I didn't even think about that visitor center in the Arizona. And
yes, you go and visit
Oklahoma.
There. Yeah, all the restaurants.
Missouri.
Yes.
Oh man.
You're there, you're visiting. You're not counting that 93,000. We don't actually know the extent of harm. But it's been really rough. And I'll say something else. You and I were at Pete Hegseth's confirmation hearing the other day, and man, was that a show.
It really was.
There were people triggered by a lot of what congressional leaders, especially on, our Democratic leaders, were saying. But the one person, who was the most triggering for me?
Who?
Mazie Hirono. She sits on the Armed Services Committee. She's Hawaii representative. I reached out to her office. I can't tell you how many times, and she's never once, even though I'm stationed here locally, like I'm over the bridge, from her, has never once agreed to meet with me in person. She talked in like a couple of things that were really triggering for me. And she talked about the readiness of our troops. She talked about accountability. And I'm like, this lady actually could impact. She could actually hold these leaders accountable. She could meet with families so that there isn't such a huge sense of institutional betrayal. Being completely betrayed and left behind is what people on her own island have felt.
Yeah.
And she had the gall to talk about accountability and the readiness of our troops when she's got 93,000 plus predominantly military families sick on her own island. That really was just really triggering for me.
Yeah. No, I understand, Mandy. And all I can say is that I am hopeful, and I hope that when the show comes out that we will be able to spread some more awareness on this issue. I'm going to link in the show notes the podcast with Walk the Talk Foundation. I'm also going to link the IG report. And my offer is always open for members of the military, members in DoD, to talk to me in their official capacity on these issues. I never want to be a podcast that only talks to the people who have issues with DoD. I've always maintained an open door to talk through these issues and to get some sort of resolve, because like our families, when somebody owns something, or even in our personal relationships, when someone owns that they made a mistake, everybody can move on. It doesn't have to be this drawn out moral injury that impacts people. This is why people have the mental health problems that they do, is that they just get no resolve and no justice to these kinds of issues. And it's a time that we stand up and we speak up and we speak out. So that's what you did today, Mandy. If people want more information and want to learn more about this, where can they find you?
I am still coming through this whole social media game, but I have posted over the years the majority of my content on Instagram. So I'm at major_mom_.
Awesome.
That's where you can find me.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right, guys. If you've stuck around this long, thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Please check me out on all the socials. You'll find my show. And as I always say, when I close out the podcast, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and bye-bye now.